Okay, we are going to begin the last section of Chapter 17, Reconstruction. And in this last section, we are going to see how Reconstruction begins to decline. Now, this does happen over a period of time, but you have to remember that Reconstruction had been going on since 1865, and since the war ended, and also Radical Reconstruction, which was the Radical Republicans' plan for Reconstruction, that really began full force in 1867. So it's going to be many, many years of this. And so what happens is Northerners start to believe that it was time for the South to deal with their own problems, that it was now going to be up to the individual states to deal with their own issues and not a federally led charge. Because the North is starting to see that they're having their own problems. And so what happens is radical Republican leaders, they kind of begin to disappear. They're getting older, they're getting voted out of office, and then you have an increase in racial prejudice in the North. And this basically comes from people who were opponents of Reconstruction, and they start to blame the African Americans for kind of taking all of the attention of the government. And so basically this is an increase in racial prejudice, which at the beginning, especially during the Civil War, the North was not really in that boat. They were filled with abolitionists, but they start to get just tired of the Reconstruction process. And so you have revolt within the Republican Party. This happens through a couple different things. First, Grant, who is the president for 2 terms, you're going to see his second election here in just a minute. He has some corruption within his cabinet. This leads to a split of the Republican Party, which is never good when your party splits. And so you have this liberal group of Republicans and Democrats. They kind of get together to try and get Grant to lose his second election, but it doesn't work. Grant actually wins against Horace Greeley. Obviously, you've never heard of him. He does not become the president. Ulysses S. Grant begins his second term, and when he does this, when he wins, he passes something called the Amnesty Act. The Amnesty Act basically pardoned most white Southerners for anything that had been done during the Civil War. Now, this was proposed by the liberal Republicans, which was passed in Congress, and it basically gave former Confederates the right to vote and the ability to hold political office. This leads to the Democrats regaining power in the South. So in states that were mostly white in the South, the Democrats begin to regain power. They regain power at the state level and they regain power at the federal level. In states that were majority African Americans, the KKK and other groups like them use intimidation tactics and violence to make sure that the Democrats come back into power. So by 1876, so think about this, in 1867, so it's 9 years earlier when the Radical Republicans took over Reconstruction, and they basically gained control of all of those states in the South, all 11 Civil War Confederate states. 9 years later, they only held a majority in 3 of those states. And so some scandals from the Republican Party leads to an economic depression in the South, and Democrats end up taking control of Congress for the first time since before the Civil War. So that means in Congress, in the Senate, and in the House of Representatives, there were more Democrats than there were Republicans. Okay, and this leads to the election of 1876. So Grant is not going to run for a 3rd term because, no one else had. And the Republicans support Rutherford B. Hayes. This is a very, very close election. Remember, the Republicans are starting to lose power, and so it was going to be an important election for them to win. Rutherford B. Hayes was the governor of Ohio, quote-unquote known for his honesty. And the Democrats selected someone named Samuel Tilden. Now, Tilden actually wins the popular vote. He receives 250,000 more votes than Rutherford B. Hayes. However, Tilden was 1 vote short in the Electoral College, and Hayes wins the election by 1 Electoral College vote. So very, very tight race, won by the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, right after he wins the presidency, Congress passes the Compromise of 1877. So remember, even though it's a Republican president, the Democrats control Congress. And so the Compromise of 1877 puts an end to Reconstruction. Rutherford B. Hayes, under his first term, puts an end to Reconstruction. And what the Compromise of 1877 does is it withdraws all remaining troops from the South. So all of those federal troops that had been put down there from the Radical Reconstruction Act of 1867, that's 10 years earlier, when they divided up the states into military districts, they get sent home. No more troops in the South. The southern states are going to be on their own. They're going to be dealing with their own issues. The Democrats in the South promised, and I kind of do air quotes when I do that, to retain African American rights. And this puts an end to Reconstruction. Now you're going to see in the second half that the Democrats actually do not retain African American rights, and they begin to pass laws that actually make things very difficult for the African Americans. But we will get that in part 2 of 17.4. So that's for tomorrow. See you then.